Okay, so Rose, I wouldn't want you to, if I ever just started by reading the text, I wouldn't want you to faint and pass
All
out.
I had was oatmeal for breakfast. And why would you have all that stuff?
Ruth, you didn't have the Bregman special this morning?
That looks yummy.
Yeah. Wow. So now you're not going to be focused at all. Would you give her a piece of candy or something? Well, I didn't want Ruth to pass out and fall out of her chair if I actually started reading. Rose, I'm sorry. We're studying the book of Rose together. She wouldn't have far to go. I don't think you'd injure yourself. All right, one of my all-time favorite, well, there's front seats if you need them. There's a couple scattered. If you don't want to sit elbow to elbow with, anyone in the back, there's spacious seats available right in front. One of my favorite films, The Sixth Sense. Spoiler alert here. Who has not seen the movie and does not want to have the ending spoiled? Or you don't care? You don't care? You sure, Olivia? You aren't going to watch it for Halloween this week, this coming week? M. Night Shyamalan is the director, and I absolutely love some of his films, and this was his first major film, and it was his biggest success. Anyone know what other films he's done? Signs. I really love Signs with Mel Gibson, and The Village, and Unbreakable. I love Unbreakable, right? You've seen that? And he's done some real stinkers too, a couple flops. But The Sixth Sense is known for its whopper of a surprise ending, where you don't realize, again, spoiler alert, does anyone care? Anyone going to be watching it? You don't realize the entire time this boy can see dead people, and this is his, Bruce Willis is playing the psychologist, the psychiatrist who's trying to help him. And you don't realize till the end of the film, Mel Gibson is himself dead, and no one else in the film.
Bruce Willis.
I'm getting all my names crossed. Bruce Willis is dead. You realize it then at the very, very end. He's been dead the whole time, and that's why the kid can see him. And you don't realize it till after. This is the point about Ruth. This has a point. You don't realize till afterward he's been dead the whole time, and no one else in the film has ever looked at him or said a thing to him except the boy. But it's so skillfully done. It just looks like he's going about things with everyone else. So what I didn't know until much later after I'd seen the film is Shyamalan inserted into the film some visual cues. Does anyone know about the red scenes in The Sixth Sense? That whenever there's red, that the film has, these are really poor quality, but I bought the movie and then I took pictures of my iPad because you can't screenshot it. It's copyrighted where you can't screenshot it or record it on your screen. So the movie has almost no red in the color palette, except where Shyamalan intended to insert it. So here he thinks he's talking to his wife. He's shot at the beginning of the film. He doesn't know he's dead, and neither does the audience. And he thinks she's just ignoring her and mad because he's late. But really, she doesn't know he's there. And she grabs the check and leaves, but she's wearing red. Then later, and Shyamalan said, these aren't very good quality, but her nails are red and she's wearing red. Shyamalan said the red he inserted everywhere, there was some impact of a spirit or a ghost that was indicating sometimes it's some negative effect or just something that was a cue that there was something going on with the spirit world here. And the red doorknob is the most famous one, where Bruce can't open that doorknob the whole movie. He goes over several times, he can't open it. But notice it's the only thing that's red. Again, poor quality picture. But the red balloon that floats up the spiral staircase, and then when the boy follows, he's wearing red. His little hideout where he's trying to stay away, where the ghosts won't bother him, is a little tent he made. It's red because they come inside there with him. And then at the funeral, it's absolute stunning scene here. She's wearing red and the red flowers. Again, there's no red anywhere else in the film, and that's why it's this sort of cue of something bigger that's going on. Well, the reason I'm saying all that is the film then, when you go back and watch it later, even though you already know the big surprise. But now it's actually much more interesting because you're looking for these little things, right? You're looking for how the story was devised and told by Shyamalan, wrote, produced, and directed it. And so it's all Shyamalan. So you're looking at that and you're thinking about now what you already know. And so that's the reason, let me get back to our text. That's the reason it's worth it, I think, to spend all that time. We did 2 classes introducing a book and talking about key words we need to look for. What are these key passages? What are some of the theological emphases in the book? I'm assuming we all, basically almost all of us, if not all of us, have a basic familiarity already with the story. So it's not like we're reading it for the first time and we're going to be struck by the drama in the same way when you're first exposed to it and you don't know what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen. But now we're going back and we're looking for things here as we go into the text. Ahead of time, we're thinking about all these cues that God, the Holy Spirit, had the author, who's the narrator of this lovely story, use to shape the plot and to make an impact on us. So I hope that makes sense to you. And one last thing before we look at the text. Here's how many classes we have. We're right here today, right? So we've got 1, and then the 31st here. And 3 is not next, right? Then there's 2. And then next week will be Brother Bacon. Jim is going to, maybe you don't remember, that's a callback to another class. Brother Bacon Jim is going to teach class for me on Sunday and Wednesday, and I'll be at a lectureship in Virginia, the one that I used to direct in the Richmond area. Kim and I are going there and then going to see my mother for a couple days, so that's why we won't be back till the end of that week. So then we have, if I'm counting correctly, then we'll have, and then this one we won't have because it's a devotional service before Thanksgiving. So we should have 7 classes to get through these 4 short chapters. Can I do it? Do you think I can do it? We can do this if we ever get to the text. So look, verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled. All right, we said this, putting the setting here, this is an extremely significant statement of itself. Not just because I pointed out last time the passage is being set up for us as far as time goes, chronologically. It's grounding it historically. It follows the time of the judges. It's in the pre-monarchical period before there is a king in Israel. Geographically, it's pinpointed down to the Bethlehem of Judah, which of course we know is extremely significant in Bible history as the place where God steps into this world through our Redeemer in the person of Christ, and personally introduces the characters, but also theologically we're seeing some things. That was at the very end of class last time. So it was in the days when the judges ruled, and isn't it refreshing then to think that these were godless times, troubled times, where Israel was in a downward spiral of apostasy. We pointed that out again and again in the book of Judges. But doesn't this show us this story that's come to such a relief to us? That even in godless times, godly people can live godly lives and still love the Lord and still trust God, even when God's own people around you are not. That's very encouraging to me, that first line, that it starts by telling us, yes, this was in the days when those judges ruled. And the famine in the land, we said God elsewhere, like for example in the case of Joseph, they used the famine to get Joseph and his brothers in Egypt, where he preserved them. So I think, just to remind or to inform those who are not here, based on these texts from Deuteronomy and the covenant blessings and curses that God said he would shut up the heavens, and it's stated in highly metaphorical terms, make the heavens above them like iron, make them hard where there would be no rain and they would be punished. And so the famine seems to be a divine rebuke or chastisement of the people. They're suffering because if they had been faithful under the covenant, this would not have happened to them. In fact, later in Ruth, I added this. This is why I went back to this, because I added it. Ruth 1:21. Later, Naomi says that the Lord has brought calamity or evil. Some Bibles might say evil, but harm. Has brought harm to me. Well, Joshua 24:20, listen to what Joshua told the people. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm. He'll do you harm. That's the same Hebrew term that Naomi uses when she comes back to the land without a husband, without her sons, after this famine. So after he's done you good, he said he will turn and harm you and consume you after he has done you good. It's interesting that same language is used. So it seems like this famine is, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it, but given what he told the people through Moses in the covenant blessings and curses, that this would not have happened in Israel had they been faithful to the Lord. And so God's people, their own unfaithfulness ends up being used by God to still work in the lives of people who ultimately end up trusting him. And it says this famine in the land. Now, it's hard for us to imagine what it's like. In fact, impossible to try to understand what it's like when there's a famine. Because if we have some meteorological catastrophe or some kind of drought that affects the growing seasons, or a blight or something like that in the modern world, because of our global economy, we get food from somewhere else. And it might cost more, but we don't know what it's like to wonder, there's no harvest. What are we going to eat this winter? There's no food. I can't even begin to grasp what that is like. The Holodomor in the Ukraine, where Stalin intentionally pursued a policy to intentionally starve tens of millions of Ukrainians to death, it's beyond our comprehension, the kind of suffering and the plight of people who are in a situation where, like Mao in a similar thing in his Great Leap Forward that resulted in mass starvation in China in the 1958 through 61 or so, and tens of millions of people died. We live in such security and comfort that we can't maybe understand what an emergency this would be for people. So there was a famine in the land. So it's natural that a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn. That means to go as a stranger, to travel there as a foreigner, not to settle in, but we're sojourning here through this life. That's the way we are told to think of our time here in this age, is we're just sojourners. So in other words, he doesn't plan to just move there permanently, but he doesn't realize he's going to die there. And his sons are going to die there. In the country of Moab, let's see if this will work. This would be great if it does. To give us a little perspective here. I'm going to try this. Okay, let's plug in where we are right here. I love the animation here. So think of where this is relative to where we are. In fact, wow. Michael, go outside and wave so we can see you. We'll wait. We'll wait. Okay, so let's go to Bethlehem. Now watch this. Watch this. Imagine this. People who lived before us could not imagine that we could view the world this way. And so we go to the other side of the earth. Is anyone getting nauseous here? Okay. All right, so this is Bethlehem. Now, so I have a slide, though, to show us what we're talking about here. This is a screen capture from that. Here's what we're dealing with. The Moabites lived in this region here. The Moabites, and then below them the Ammonites. To the east of the Dead Sea. And Bethlehem is about over here. And so they have to go up and over into the land of Moab, where they hear that there'll be food, there'll be work, there'll be a way to survive. And other people, I take it everyone's trying to do whatever he can back in Judah to survive. So what happens? He sojourned in the country of Moab. We already talked about the Moabites and the problem that they have been historically for Israel up to this point. Their god is Chemosh. They are a pagan culture, yet we see Ruth. We can judge cultures by their ideology, by their worldview, by their practices, by their ethics, but we judge people individually based on their ethics and their character. And Ruth stands out, of course. But still, this is a pagan people. And so they're going to live in a foreign land with a foreign language under another king. And this is a monumental move. So he and his wife, he went with his two sons. Now here we have the names. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. And they went into notice the inclusio. They went to Moab. He names them and says, and they went to Moab. That's a literary device we often point out to sort of bracket that. They went in the country of Moab and remained there. So the plan might have been just to sojourn. We're going to go there and sojourn in that country, but they end up staying. How long, in fact, do they stay before Naomi finally travels back after her husband and sons are dead? About 10 years, it says down in verse 4. So, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. All right, your husband dies. Imagine this. Widowhood was a much greater burden in the ancient world than it is in our culture. We have a completely different economic system. We have means for widows to be self-supporting, to be independent, and to be able to take care of themselves and live alone and prosper. It's not like in the ancient world. If you were widowed, what were your options? Now, if you had sons, then you take care of you, right? Children can take care of you. Or you can go back to your father's house. Well, they're living in the land of Moab. It puts you in a precarious situation, and that's why there's so much emphasis in the law when God is emphasizing compassion and listing the laws that set out how they're to treat each other. There's special emphasis on the sojourner and the widow and the orphan. Remember that triad in Deuteronomy over and over? Because widows were vulnerable. Someone could take the property that belonged to her husband, buy it out from under her, and leave her without a place. And they were dependent on the benevolence of others. So Paul talks about that. We'll get to that in a minute. Paul talks in the New Testament as well about widows that need to be supported by the church. So notice that Elimelech dies, and this alone would be a great tragedy, to lose your husband. And many of you know what that's like, and the pain that you experience when you lose a spouse. But on top of that, tragedy is magnified. Verse 3, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. She was left with her two sons. But verse 4, these took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah. My mind sees Oprah every time I see that, but Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. She was left. So now we have 3 widows. And one was depending on, no doubt, her sons, was taken into their household. Now both their sons have died. Now, can you imagine that? Those of you who've lost a spouse. Imagine losing your children too. And I hope that's not happened to anyone here. But imagine, it's almost like Job, the proportions of Job, where all of his children die. All of her children now, the 2 sons she had, they're both dead. And the story is told, this is just setting up what's to follow. And so it's told very briefly, very matter-of-factly. We're not told how they died. We might want to know all that, but that's not the point the writer wants us to understand. He wants us to understand Naomi, the story starts with emptiness and bitterness and loss and sorrow, famine. There's suffering. There's hardship that is magnified. And we start reading the story and it seems pretty depressing. Yet this is one of the most delightful, uplifting stories in the Bible. But it's the edifying nature of the story is made more so by the fact that we see the plight of these people when it begins. And this woman, Naomi, who's really the focus of the story, ultimately, is Naomi. Now, what about marrying these Moabite sons? Someone asked me about that, and I don't agree. I read one commentary that said this was in direct violation of the law, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. In Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4, the Israelites were expressly forbidden from intermarrying with the Canaanites, and 7 nations representing the Canaanites were listed there. Is it warm in here? Is it just me?
It's
wow.
warm.
It's warm. Wait, do we have an elder with authority to turn the air down back there? Maybe Joe could bump it down. If someone put it on 71, that usually helps a lot. Maybe because it was cool outside earlier, it didn't kick on for some reason, or even 70. We'll freeze out some of our widows. We'll show compassion, right? So, was it a sin to marry the Canaanite peoples? Yes. What about those outside of the land of Canaan, like the Moabites? Well, if it wasn't sinful, it surely was problematic. And I'm going to give you an example of what happens later, much later in their history. If you'll turn to Ezra, look at Ezra chapter 9, where after the people come back from captivity, they ended up intermarrying with the non-Israelites in the land who had settled in the region around them. And so, notice verse 2. There's this concern. Well, actually, let's read verse 1. After these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, they approached Ezra and said, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations from the Canaanites. Now here's some of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites. But see, now the Moabites weren't strictly in that list back in Deuteronomy when God said you shall not intermarry with the peoples of the land. But here they're listed as those among whom, from whom they should have separated themselves. So notice he says they've... Verse 2, they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race was mixed itself with the peoples of the lands. And in this faithlessness, the hand of the officials and the chief men has been foremost. The leaders and the priests and the Levites have been the worst. They've all intermarried with these pagan peoples, just taken wives from them. And so, notice the prayer, verse 6, saying, oh my God, this is him praying now, Ezra. Oh, my God, I am ashamed and I blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities are higher than our heads and our guilt is mounted up to the heavens. Very dramatic prayer here that's uttered. And the solution was they determined under the direction of Shechaniah, who spoke for God, they had to put those wives away. So I take it this was an alarming situation. The problem here was so alarming and so widespread that it threatened Israel and the bloodline, of course, ultimately through whom the Messiah is going to come. And so that's why in this case it was not tolerated and they were required to put away those wives. Now, this suggests to me that this was not a good move on Elimelech's part to go into this foreign land where his sons end up marrying these foreign women. If not outrightly sinful, it certainly is problematic. And yet, if they're like Ruth, one of them's Ruth, look what she turned out to be. So it's a tough thing. I always encourage very strongly that we need to raise our children. I make an emphasis that we need to raise our children, pray with them, and teach them about the importance of marrying faithful Christians who will help them go to heaven rather than someone who could hinder them from going to heaven. And they're going to be yoked together in the most intimate relationship that you can possibly have. And so you want someone who loves God like you love God, is going to help you to love God and help you go to heaven. But sometimes people marry non-Christians and their spouses turn out to be more decent to them than people who marry Christians who turn out to treat them terribly. So I know there are sometimes exceptions, but I still say you see a pattern in the Old Testament that it's a problem when the patriarchs' sons, like when Esau intermarried with the Hittite women, and it was such a grief to his mother, and Abraham's concerned that his servant Eliezer go and leave the Canaanite land and go get him a wife for his son, because he didn't want his son intermarrying with the peoples of the land there. You see a pattern here where obviously it's a concern that whom we marry is a big deal. And Paul even says in 1 Corinthians 9, when he's arguing that the apostles had a right to be married. Paul was unmarried, but Peter was married. And he said, don't we have a right to have a wife like Cephas? And he points out that Peter had a wife because he was being questioned by the church there. No matter what he did, he was questioned. If he took their money, they questioned it. The people who were his enemies questioned it. If he didn't take their money to support their support so that he wouldn't create any objection that he's using them for their money, they would criticize him for not taking money. If he was a real apostle, he'd say that you have to support him. And it's similar, it seems to be, with his marriage situation. He said, now don't we have a right to a wife, listen, who is a believer? Like Peter, 1 Corinthians 9. I believe it's verse 2, but I didn't check. And then, of course, later in 1 Corinthians 7, he says a widow is free to marry whom she wants, only in the Lord. That's an interesting expression. Does it mean a Christian? I don't think necessarily, but that seems to be what is ideal. So, so now they've intermarried with Moabite women, and he's dead. His sons are dead. Look at the names that, as we're introduced to these characters. I'm trying to throw things out so that I don't forget. The names of these characters are important to us here. There. Elimelech, Melech is the word for king, the Hebrew word for king. And so El, you see El, God is my king. El, Elimelech, El, and you have the Lamed, you have the connection of El and Melech, king. My God is king. Malon means sickness. Chilion means destruction. Now, who would name their kid sickness and destruction? It seems like they're not really thinking about the meaning of the names when they name their kid. Just like we weren't thinking about, well, when we named Jessica, we weren't thinking, now, what does Jessica mean? We just like the sound of it. We like the aesthetics of it. So we just chose it. But we don't choose names that have meanings. It just seems to be ironic that these happen to be the names of her boys who died. In fact, Orpah's name means neck or nape. And some think that's a suggestion that she does not, a key word in the opening chapter and in the book is return and to turn. And she does not turn and go with Naomi. She sort of keeps her neck from turning and stays in the land of Moab. Interesting. We don't know exactly what Ruth's name means, but a lot of times you hear it said it means friendship, but we think that's kind of an imposition of our perspective on her. Not really sure. It could mean a well-watered or fertile, which also would seem to fit the story. And of course, we know Naomi means pleasant because she says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara, which means bitter. So we know that these names, these characters are introduced to us, and the plot already is interesting just by the names we see. So all the major characters are introduced and the situation is set before us. A last thought on this statement at the end of verse 5. So that she was left without her sons and her husband. Look at, 1 Timothy 5, just as a good verses 4 and 5 on the idea of widowhood, where Paul says, honor widows who are truly widows. So there's some widows who are genuinely in need and some who are not. So he said, but if a widow has children, see the idea? If she has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. For this is pleasing in the sight of God. So we should take care of our parents or even our grandparents if we're able to do that before the church should be burdened. But Naomi doesn't have that, right? She doesn't have any sons. She doesn't have any grandchildren. So verse 5, she who is truly a widow, and here it is. Look at this. It's interesting. Left all alone. Left all alone. Has her hope on God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. She's left all alone. Here in Ruth 1:5, it says she ended up being all alone. In 2 Samuel, we don't have time to look at the whole context. Chapter 14, verse 7. Joab, the commander of David's army, hires a woman to go pretend to be someone to David and tell him this story. It ends up being a lesson of sort of like Nathan, when Nathan rebuked David, a parable almost, to try to get David to see how he should treat Absalom, his son. So when she goes and tells the story, notice what she says to him, 2 Samuel 14:7. And now the whole clan has arisen against me, your servant. And they say, give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whhom he killed. She said, look, I had 2 sons. I'm a widow. I had 2 sons. Think of Naomi. She's a widow. She has 2 sons. She said, one of my sons argued with the other one and killed him. And they got in a fight and he killed him. Now everyone in the community, everyone in my tribe is saying, we need to execute your other son because he committed murder. And so he needs to die too. And listen to what she says. And so they would destroy the heir, and thus they would quench my coal that is left, and to leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. This is a colossal calamity. That's what she's saying. I'd have no heir. If my other son dies, the name of my husband dies. And this is how you lived on among your people through your descendants. So she said, please, this is a unique situation. His life has to be spared. Don't kill my other son. I will be left with nothing. That's exactly the situation Naomi's in. So these other passages sort of highlight just how desperate her condition was. Because the writer doesn't go into all that. He could. But we see the point of how bad things are. So now we get to Act 1, Scene 1 of the actual drama. That's the setting. Any thought on the setting before we start to go and look at what's going to happen here?
I have a thought.
Yes, ma'am.
So for 10 years, Naomi has been a mother-in-law to these 2 Moabite women. And they've lived together closely.
I take it, yes.
And it seems like Orpah has chosen to go back to her people, which Naomi asked her to do.
Right.
Go back to your people and to your gods.
Right. It's important that Orpah is not judged or presented in an ill light. I'm going to talk about that tonight. It's all Ruth all day today here at the League City Church of Christ. You're going to be so Ruthed out by the end of the day. But yeah, we'll talk about that later. She obeys Naomi's wishes. And the point is that makes Ruth's devotion all the more extraordinary. But
the relationship, it seems to me that Ruth truly loves Naomi as a mother.
Oh,
And
the love is
because
profound.
Of that love and Naomi's situation, she's not going to leave her. And sometimes we don't know the family dynamics of Ruth and her family before she left them and was cleaving to her husband's family. So what I'm saying is that Ruth truly loved Naomi as a mother.
All right, we're getting to that. Because you're getting ahead of me. You just preached my sermon this morning. You could take the Lord's Supper and leave today. Debbie got ahead of me, so we're thinking alike, Debbie. That's good. Well, all right. So then, notice, let's go to this Act 1, Scene 1. So now the story's told differently. Now it's mostly dialogue. See, now the narrator's not going to tell us that this is the kind of person Naomi was, and she was like this. But then this is the kind of person Ruth was, and her husband had been like this, and she was this way. It's all now told through the intrigue of the dialogue between the characters, and that makes it a little harder to interpret it, the motives and whether what's being done is being praised or approved of. Like Elimelech, should he have left his land and gone into Moab to begin with? I forgot to raise that question because that's a good example. The narrator doesn't deal with that. And it's similar to Abraham when there was a famine in the land of Canaan. He went to Egypt in Genesis 12, remember? And it seems to be perhaps a lack of faith on his part. Remember, we talked about that? And he ends up in Egypt, and it puts his wife in peril. And he ends up in a very precarious situation there. And the writer of Genesis doesn't tell us, about his doubts or his feelings or his thoughts. But it seems to be suggested like that this was something Abraham maybe panicked and went down to Egypt. And what do you think about what Elimelech did? He's just trying to feed his family, right? I'm not going to say, I don't know if it was a lack of faith on his part, that if he'd just trust the Lord, if he'd be obedient, that even in the midst of a famine, God could get him and his family through it. But look at what develops as a result of that. So now we get the dialogue where now we have to sort of see what kind of people they are from the things that they say. So we're not given that omniscient narrator perspective that tells you what they were thinking. You get that later in Samuel where we're told what someone's thinking when something's developing. So this is a major shift now. That's the segment that introduces the book. What about the drama? So then she arose, verse 6, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, I have it on the screen, and I keep forgetting that at the bottom, you can't see the bottom too well, let me put it up. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. Now I'm going to circle that word, return. The word shuv in the Hebrew, this is an important word. Now watch how it comes up in this opening chapter. To return, and make sure I get the right slide here. All right. Shuv, this word shuv, it can mean to turn or just to go or to bring back 12 times in chapter 1. Verse 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12. Verse 15 and 16, 21 and 22. It's twice in 2 verses. And then later we're going to come back to it. I have there at the bottom if you can't see it. Chapter 4, verse 15, we end up seeing how that word ties together the story, but I've demonstrated it for you here. You're going to enjoy this. You're going to watch it. You're going to sit here and watch it and like it because it took me a while to get this together. So watch this. Now, if this works the way I practice it, it should turn out great. I've highlighted here in a little blue highlighter the times you see the word return. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I should be able to just scroll the text. Yeah. No! I can't do that. So, all right, let's just look at it then. Right here. Turn back. It's the same word each time. Return. Turn back. It's the same word. Now I should be able to scroll, right? You keep going through the text. Look at there, verse 15.
Tyler?
See how many times. Is it working?
Tyler?
Yeah.
Our bells didn't ring?
It's already after time.
It is.
Yeah.
Did I miss the ring?
No, the bell didn't ring.
All right, let me end here with this. Let me slide this up and we're done. Notice then down here at the bottom, all those times the word return. Brought me back. That's also the same word. Return, 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 return. So if you could see that visually, that effect. You see how many times return, 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 return. Well, what does that do with, there we go. What does that have to do at the end of the story? When you get to the end of the story, it said they returned. God turned. God brought them back. So there's another cue there to the story. That was the fastest 5 minutes of my life. Wow. All right. Well, Act 1, Scene 1, Wednesday night. When is the game in Houston?
7 something.
No, when they come back to Houston.
Tuesday.
And Wednesday.
No, we're not gonna need Wednesday.
So we could have won the World Series by Wednesday, by this coming Wednesday, huh?
Yep.
Well, if so, I got the socks on. And they match nothing, but my motto is don't let coordination stand in the way of celebration, right? Celebration takes precedence over coordination.
Hey, Tyler. Tyler.